Hello there. Settle in, get comfortable, and leave the day behind. Tonight's story is about a choice. It's about leaving behind a world of soft earth and nurturing sunlight for one of cold steel and lonely moonlight. Picture yourself as a young boy, your hands molded by the soil of your father's farm, your life measured in the turning of seasons. But when a storm of violence tears that world apart, you find a new tool in the mud, a dead man's sword. For now though, just close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let the journey from farmer to swordsman begin. My world began with soil, and I knew the feeling of mud long before I knew my own name, as it was the first and last thing I touched each day. It would squeeze between my toes in the paddy in a cool and vital embrace, and it caked my hands and dried under my nails, serving as a constant reminder of where I came from. We were people of the earth who did not conquer or command it, but served it. We bent our backs to its rhythms, with our lives measured not in years, but in the turning of seasons. Planting the seeds always felt like an act of hope, because we were trusting the earth with our future, and the harvest was always the earth's reply, its promise to see us through another year. The sun felt like a god as it beat down on my small back while I followed my father, our shadows stretching long and thin over the flooded fields. I came to learn its language from the sharp, demanding heat of midday that drove us to the shade of the willow tree, to the gentle, golden light of evening that painted the mountains in hues of purple and orange. This light was life itself, coaxing the green shoots from the dark soil, nourishing them and turning the fields into a sea of swaying gold. Our work was a partnership with the sun and the soil, where we gave our sweat and the earth gave us life in return. There was a simple truth in it all, a philosophy written not in scrolls, but in the lines on my father's hands. To nurture is to live. This piece was a fragile thing, like a thin paper screen against the storm of the world, and I was only 10 years old when that storm finally broke. They came at dusk, when the evening light had softened the edges of the world and made everything seem gentle. They were not men of the earth, but shadows cut from a different cloth, carrying the jagged edges of iron and malice. They were bandits, and the word itself was a curse that left a foul taste in the mouth. The screams began near the miller's house, sharp and ragged sounds that tore the quiet evening air to shreds. My father shoved me under the floorboards of our hut, his face a mask of terror I had never seen before. "Do not make a sound," he hissed, his voice trembling, and the world became a narrow space of splintered wood and the smell of damp earth. Through a crack in the floor, I watched as the world I knew burned. They were a pack of wolves, laughing while they scattered the embers of our lives and moved with a hungry, careless violence. Then a new shape appeared on the path. He was a lone wanderer with 2 swords at his hip and a travel-worn kimono. A ronin. He didn't shout or make a grand entrance, but simply walked into the chaos, a single point of stillness in a whirlwind of fear. The bandits turned toward him, their laughter turning to sneers. It was 1 man against a dozen, an impossible fight. But then he moved, and his blade left its sheath with a sound like singing steel, a whisper that cut through the roar of the flames. This was nothing like my father chopping wood with a hatchet. The ronin became a blur of motion, a dance of death under the rising moon as the air filled with the wet percussive sound of steel hitting flesh and bone. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a force, a whirlwind of destruction that left but bodies in its wake. How could one person, a vessel of flesh and blood, just like my father, contain such a storm? His sword was an extension of his will, a thought made sharp and lethal, and he took lives as easily as my father pulled weeds from the paddy. The ronin was both magnificent and terrifying, like a demon. He fought with a desperate grace, his feet finding purchase in the muddy path as he spun and cut. But the bandits were a tide that crashed against him again and again. For every one he cut down, 2 more took their place, and soon I saw him tire, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A blade caught him in the shoulder, and he stumbled, then another slashed across his leg. He fell to one knee, but his sword was still in his hand, a defiant fang of steel. The leader of the bandits, a big man with a cruel laugh, stepped forward and brought his own sword down in a brutal, final arc. The ronin fell, and the whirlwind was still. The bandits eventually left, their hunger sated, and I waited until the silence was broken only by the crackle of dying fires and a soft sound of weeping. When I finally crawled out from my hiding place, the village was a ruin where the air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the bitter scent of smoke. I saw the ronin lying in the path, his body a broken thing, and there, half buried in the mud and gore, was his katana. It lay where it had fallen from his grip, its blade dulled by the dirt. I approached it slowly, my bare feet sinking into the same mud that had sustained my life. My tools were the hoe and the sickle, tools meant to work with the earth and encourage life. But this thing was different. It had no connection to the soil because it was made for one purpose: to end things. I reached down, my small hands trembling as I felt the hilt wrapped in dark cloth, worn smooth by the ronin's grip. When I tried to lift it, the weight shocked me. It was impossibly heavy, a solid piece of the world's cruelty that felt so much colder than the living earth. As my fingers closed around the hilt, I was no longer just a farmer's son. I was holding a question that had no answer, a piece of a man's soul left behind in the mud. The weight of it was the weight of death, and it was the first thing I ever chose to pick up on my own. For 2 years, the sword remained my secret. I had cleaned the mud and blood from its steel, wrapped it in an old oilcloth, and hidden it deep in the thatch of our storehouse roof, where it became a dark star around which my life now secretly orbited. During the day, I was still my father's son. I worked the paddies, my hands relearning the familiar shapes of our tools as I felt the sun on my back and watched the seasons turn. But something inside me had changed. The simple truth of the earth was no longer enough, as it felt like a story told to a child, a pleasant lie meant to hide the more terrible reality that the world was not a nurturing mother, but a place of wolves and wandering swords. My real life began when the rest of the village slept, when I would slip out of our hut and retrieve the katana from its hiding place. In the deep woods, under the silent watch of the moon, I would begin my clumsy ritual. The sword was not a part of me. Holding it felt like holding a bolt of lightning because it was heavy, stubborn, and utterly alien. My first swings were pathetic as the blade would wobble in the air, pulling at my thin arms and twisting my body off balance. I would swing with all my might at a shadow or a low-hanging branch, and the force of it would send me stumbling, my breath catching in my throat. The ronin had made it look like a dance, but for me, it was a fight against the sword itself. Night after night, I returned to the woods, and my training became a litany of frustration. I would try to mimic the movements I had seen through the crack in the floorboards, picturing the ronin's fluid grace and the way his body and blade seemed to be one entity. But my body was that of a farmer, with muscles built for the slow, repetitive work of the fields, not for the explosive speed the sword demanded. My hands, calloused from the hoe, were soon raw and blistered from the unforgiving hilt of the katana, and the wood of the trees became my first opponent. I would hack at them, leaving ugly, splintered scars in their bark, but the tree always won. It stood unmoving while I was left panting, my arms burning with exhaustion and my spirit raw with failure. My internal world was a storm of conflicting emotions as a deep, cold anger had taken root in my heart against the bandits and the world that allowed them to exist. But there was also a burning frustration with myself because I couldn't make the sword obey. I remember the ronin's last moments, how he was skilled and moved like a whirlwind, but in the end, it was not enough. The memory of his death was a constant spur, though I was not chasing heroism and had no illusions of saving anyone. This was a desperate, selfish act, an attempt to forge a will hard enough to stand against the cruelty I had witnessed. The world had shown me that it could take everything away in an instant, and I was determined to become something it could not so easily break. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. My clumsy swings became a little more controlled, and I learned to use my hips and legs to generate power from the ground up, just as my father had taught me to do when pushing the plow. The calluses on my hands thickened and hardened into a new shape, molded by the sword's hilt. I began to understand the blade's balance, the precise point where its weight felt right, and it became less of a burden and more of a partner. I started with a single, straight downward cut, practicing it 1,000 times until my muscles screamed. Then I moved to a horizontal cut, then a diagonal one. Each small victory was paid for in sweat and pain, each improvement a tiny spark of light in the vast darkness of my ignorance. I was not learning the way of the sword so much as clawing at it, trying to steal its secrets in the dark. I had no teacher, only the ghost of a dead man and the unyielding resistance of the steel in my hands. The sword was a cruel master that offered no encouragement and no praise, only its impossible weight and its single, deadly purpose. And in my lonely struggle, I was being remade. The boy who had known only the life-giving earth was slowly, painfully, giving way to something else as I forged myself in the crucible of my own anger and resolve, one clumsy, desperate swing at a time. The weight of the sword was becoming the weight of my own will. By the time I was 15, my hands told the story of two different lives. The broad, tough calluses from the plow were still there, a map of my childhood, but they were overlaid with a new terrain of harder, more focused calluses that wrapped around my palms and fingers. They were the marks of the sword, a secret script that only I could read. The farm that had once been my entire world now felt like a cage, and the cyclical rhythm of planting and harvest no longer seemed like a comforting truth, but a circle that I had to break. The earth could give life, but it could not protect it, and its embrace felt soft and weak. The decision to leave came not in a storm of emotion, but in the quiet stillness before dawn as I lay on my mat, listening to my father's steady breathing in the darkness. The air was cool and smelled of damp soil and the coming morning. For years, I had lived a double life with my body in the fields and my soul in the woods with the stolen sword. But the two halves of myself could no longer coexist. The sword demanded everything. It was a jealous master that would not share me with the land, and to choose it was to betray everything I had ever been. I would be turning my back on my father, on our ancestors buried in the village shrine, and on the very soil that had given me shape. I rose before the sun, my movements slow and deliberate, with no anger in my heart, only a quiet, profound sense of finality. I dressed in simple clothes and went to the storehouse one last time to retrieve the katana from its hiding place. The worn leather of the scabbard felt cool against my fingers as I tied it to my hip, and the weight of it was both a comfort and a burden. It settled against me like a piece of my own skeleton, something that had always been there. Standing in the pre-dawn gloom, I was no longer a farmer's son who secretly practiced with a sword. I was a boy with a sword, and nothing else. I did not leave a note, for what words could explain this choice? How could I tell my father that I was leaving the world of nurturing life to walk a path dedicated to ending it? That question echoed in the silent chamber of my own heart. What was I becoming? Was a man defined by the tool he carried? A farmer with his hoe is a part of the earth, but a swordsman with his blade is apart from everything. He walks a lonely path, his purpose bound to the cold, unfeeling steel at his side, an agent of severance who cuts the threads that bind people to the world. In leaving my home, I was performing my first true act as a swordsman. I was cutting myself off from my own past. The journey began with a single step away from the hut, onto a road that was a pale, dusty ribbon in the growing light. Behind me lay everything I had ever known, and ahead of me lay a vast, terrifying emptiness. The world was suddenly immense, and I was utterly alone within it. The weight of the sword on my hip was the only constant, the only thing that felt real, and it was a physical reminder of the choice I had made. Each step took me further from the boy I had been. The sun rose, casting its familiar golden light over the fields, but it felt different now. It was no longer a partner in creation, but just a light that illuminated the long, empty road ahead. My mind was a quiet, meditative space as I focused on the rhythm of my own breathing, the feel of the dusty ground beneath my sandals, and the slight sway of the sword against my leg. I was shedding my old identity like a snake sheds its skin. The farmer, the son, the villager, all of it was falling away. All that was left was a boy, a sword, and a will that had been forged in the anger and frustration. I did not know where I was going, as I had no destination and no plan. My only guide was a deep, unshakable conviction that the answer to the world's cruelty was not in the soft earth, but in the hard edge of tempered steel. I walked on, leaving the world of life behind me, ready to face the world of death that awaited. 2 years on the road had hardened me, teaching me to sleep with one eye open, to read the intentions of men in the way they carried themselves, and to find food where there seemed to be none. My skill with the sword had grown, honed in minor skirmishes with bandits and arrogant ronin looking to make a name for themselves. I fought with a grim efficiency, using a style built on the foundation of my own relentless training, a style born of will rather than grace that was effective but laborious. Every victory was a struggle, a conscious effort to impose my will on my opponent, and I believed this was the true path to strength. Then I met the demon from Miyamoto village. I had heard whispers of him in roadside inns and dusty towns, where they called him Shinmen Takezo. They said he was a beast in human form, a whirlwind of violence who fought without honor or technique, driven only by an insatiable hunger for victory. The stories were wild and unbelievable, so I dismissed them as the exaggerations of frightened men, believing that no one could truly be that strong or untamed. True strength, I believed, was something you built piece by piece through discipline and will. I found him by a river where the midday sun was hot and the air was still. He was facing 3 swordsmen, all of them older, with fine kimonos and gleaming swords, who carried themselves with the easy arrogance of men from a famous fencing school. They sneered at Takehiko, who stood before them like a stray dog. He was lanky and unkempt, his clothes ragged and his hair a wild mess, and he leaned on a long, rough-hewn wooden sword that looked more like a club than a weapon of skill. He seemed bored, almost sleepy. One of the swordsmen stepped forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're the wild dog from Miyamoto? We are here to teach you a lesson in manners. Takezo didn't answer, but just shifted his weight in a subtle movement, like a predator settling its haunches before a strike. The air grew thick with tension. I watched from the cover of the trees, my hand resting on the hilt of my own sword, expecting a duel with a testing of stances and a flurry of controlled strikes. What I witnessed was a slaughter. The first swordsman lunged, his blade a silver blur aimed at Takezo's chest in a fast, precise, well-taught technique that should have ended the fight. But Takezo didn't parry or dodge. He simply moved into the attack with a half step to the side and swung his heavy bokken in a brutal, rising arc. There was no form to it, no elegance, only pure, primal force. The wooden sword met the man's wrist with a sickening crack that echoed across the river, and the man screamed as his katana clattered to the ground. Before he could even register the pain, Takezo's bokken crashed into the side of his head, and the man dropped like a sack of stones. The other two stood frozen for a heartbeat, their arrogance shattered and replaced by stark terror before they attacked together in a desperate, panicked assault. This was not a fight anymore. It was an execution. Takezo became a force of nature, moving like an animal that was utterly present in the moment, his actions flowing from pure instinct. His raw power was absolute. He broke the blade of one man with a clumsy-looking but devastating block, then drove the splintered end of his bokken into the man's throat. He ducked under a wild swing from the third man and crippled his leg with a vicious strike, then finished him with a final, crushing blow to the skull. It was over in less than 10 breaths, and it was the most brutally efficient and terrifying thing I had ever seen. The ronin who had died in my village had been skilled, but he had fought like a man. This was different. Takezo wasn't wielding a weapon. He was the weapon. There was no separation between his will and his action, for he did not seem to think. He simply reacted, his body a perfect instrument of violence. The sight left me shaken to my core and delivered a profound, philosophical shock. I had spent years in laborious, willful training, forcing my body to obey my mind, because I believed that strength was a mountain to be climbed through sheer effort. But this boy, this demon, had not climbed the mountain. He was the mountain. His strength was not something he had learned, but something he was. A primal, terrifying force that flowed through him without thought or effort. He stood over the broken bodies, his chest rising and falling, the only sound the gentle murmur of the river. He didn't look proud or victorious. He just looked empty. He glanced over at the trees, and for a moment his eyes met mine, but there was nothing in them. No anger, no joy, no fear. It was like looking into the heart of a storm. I stayed hidden until he had gone, my body trembling. That encounter shattered my understanding of the sword and posed a terrifying question. What if true strength wasn't something you could build? What if it was something you had to be born with? A gift from the gods or the devils? For the first time, I felt a sliver of doubt in my own path. My grim resolve and my years of sweat and pain felt like the scrabbling of an ant trying to move a boulder. I had just witnessed a force of nature, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that my will alone would never be enough to stand against it. The demon of Miyamoto Village haunted me, and the memory of his raw, instinctual power was a constant challenge to my own path of willful effort. I knew I had reached a limit. My strength, born of anger and repetition, was a blunt instrument that was powerful, but crude. To face a monster like Shinmen Takezo, I needed more than just ferocity. I needed form and structure. My search for this knowledge led me to the gates of the Hosoin Temple. The monks of Hosoin were famous throughout the land for their art of the spear, and it was said their technique was a perfect fusion of martial prowess and spiritual discipline. They did not fight to kill, but to subdue, their style a cage of steel from which no swordsman could escape. I came to them not with the arrogance of a challenger, but with the desperation of a student, and I requested a duel to test my untutored skill against their legendary form. After a period of observation and questioning, they granted my request. My opponent was a young monk, not much older than myself, who was calm and centered, his face a mask of placid concentration. He carried a cross-bladed spear, a formidable weapon that seemed to be an extension of his own serene presence. We faced each other in the temple's central courtyard, the grey stones cool beneath our feet. The air was still, the only sound the distant drone of chanting monks. As I drew my katana, the familiar weight was a comfort in my hands, and I felt the fire of my will and the years of hard-won strength rising within me. The duel began. I attacked with the speed and power that had served me so well on the road, becoming a torrent, a flurry of strikes meant to overwhelm him, to break his guard and find the flesh beneath. My blade was a blur, cutting through the air with a hungry hiss, but my torrent crashed against a rock. The monk's spear was not just a weapon, it was a wall. He didn't meet my force with force, but deflected and redirected it with small, precise, and impossibly efficient movements. The long shaft of his spear controlled the distance between us, keeping my blade just inches from its target, while the cross blades near the tip were like fangs, catching my sword, trapping it, twisting it from my intended path. It was like fighting a spider in its web, because every move I made, he was there to counter it. Every lunge was met with a subtle shift of his body and a precise movement of his spear. I could not get close, as his weapon created a cage around him, a space that I could not breach. My frustration grew with each failed attack. I was expending enormous amounts of energy, my muscles burning, my breath coming in ragged bursts, while the monk, in contrast, seemed barely to be moving. He was a picture of calm control, his energy contained and focused. He was teaching me a lesson, for he saw the chaos in my strength and the untamed anger that fueled my attacks, and he showed me how easily that chaos could be contained. He began to press the attack, not with aggression, but with a relentless, flowing pressure. The tip of his spear was a constant threat, darting towards my throat, my chest, and my hands, forcing me onto the defensive, my own clumsy parries barely turning aside his precise thrusts. He controlled my posture, forcing me off balance and making me stumble. He was deconstructing my swordsmanship piece by piece, revealing its raw, untutored nature. The end came not with a fatal blow, but with a final, humbling display of superiority. I overextended on a desperate lunge, leaving myself open for a fraction of a second, and in that instant, his spear moved. The shaft slid under my sword arm, locking it, and the crossblade hooked behind my neck. With a simple, effortless twist, he threw me to the ground. I landed hard on the stone courtyard, the wind knocked from my lungs. The steel tip of his spear rested gently against my throat, and while it did not press, its cold weight was the weight of my absolute defeat. He had won without ever needing to strike a killing blow, defeating me with pure form, with a structure that my raw power could not break. As I lay there, looking up at his calm, impassive face, the fire of my anger was extinguished, replaced by the cold ashes of shame. I had come seeking to refine my power, and instead, I had learned a profound and painful lesson. My will was strong, but my form was weak. My strength was just chaos, like a wild river without banks, and I realized that true martial arts were not about unleashing power, but about creating a container strong enough to hold it. Without that container, I was just a storm that would eventually blow itself out. Defeat was a bitter taste, and the calm, effortless superiority of the Hoswain monk had done more damage to my spirit than any blade ever could, for it had shown me that my entire path of furious dedication to willful strength was built on a foundation of ignorance. Shamed and directionless, I left the temple and wandered. I walked without purpose, the sword on my hip feeling heavier than ever, no longer a symbol of my will, but a monument to my failure. My travels led me to a small, forgotten shrine deep in the mountains, and it was there, while staring blankly at a crumbling statue of a fox god, that I met him. He was an old monk, but unlike any I'd ever seen, with patched robes, a poorly shaved head, and a mischievous glint in his eye that seemed entirely out of place for a holy man. He was roasting a small fish over a tiny fire, and the smell made my empty stomach ache. Without a word, he broke the fish in two and offered me half, and I was too hungry and too tired to refuse. We ate in silence. When we were finished, he looked at me, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "You carry a heavy sword," he said, his voice surprisingly strong, "but I think you carry a heavier heart." His name was Takwan Soho. He didn't ask for my name or about my defeat, as it seemed he already knew. He saw the anger coiling in my gut, the fear of inadequacy that gnawed at my soul, and he saw that I was a man at war with himself. Our conversation was not a gentle lesson. It was more like surgery, without anesthetic. "You want to be strong?" he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Why?" The question caught me off guard. "So that I won't be broken," I answered. "So that I can stand against the cruelty of the world." Takwan laughed, a short, sharp bark that startled the birds in the trees. "You think the world is cruel?" "The world simply is. A typhoon does not hate the houses it destroys, and a wolf does not hate the rabbit it eats. You see cruelty because you are full of fear. You fight the world, but the world does not even know you are there. The opponent you are truly fighting is yourself." His words were like sharp stones, and he didn't teach me how to hold a sword or how to perfect a stance, but instead dismantled the very reason I carried a sword at all. He spoke in riddles and contradictions, Zen koans that twisted my mind into knots, asking me, "If you draw your sword to cut a man, but you miss, is the sword still a sword?" He told me stories of masters who could win without drawing their blades, and of a strength that came from yielding, not from resisting. "Your mind is full," he said, tapping his forehead. "It is full of anger from the past and fear of the future. It is full of ideas about strength, about victory, about yourself. A full cup cannot be filled. To master the sword, you must first empty your mind." He saw the memories that drove me, the burning village, the dying ronin, the terrifying power of Takezo, and the humiliating spear of Hozoin. He saw how I had chained myself to these moments, how I carried them with me every day, and he showed me that my single-minded pursuit of strength was not a noble path, but an escape. I was running from the boy who had hidden under the floorboards, helpless and afraid. "You believe the sword is a tool to impose your will on the world," Takwan said, his voice softening slightly. "But a sword has no will. It is a piece of steel, and it is a mirror. When you look at your blade, you see only your own troubled mind. You see anger, so your cut is angry. You see fear, so your block is fearful. You think you are mastering the sword, but you are only a slave to your own heart." The conversation lasted for hours, perhaps days, as time seemed to lose its meaning in the presence of this strange monk. He was chipping away at the armor I had spent years building around myself, forcing me to look into the emptiness I was so desperately trying to fill with a skill and strength. He spoke of the uncarved mind, a state of being that was pure, empty, and ready for anything. A mind that did not judge or fear, but simply was. By the time I left him, I was utterly undone. He had given me no answers, no techniques, and no new path to follow. He had simply taken my old one apart and shown me that it led nowhere. He had introduced me to a new enemy, one far more formidable than any swordsman, my own mind, my own self. And he had left me with a single, devastating thought. To truly master the sword, I would have to let go of everything I thought I was. I would have to become empty. The teachings of Takuan Soho were a poison and a medicine that left me adrift and my certainties shattered. The path of the sword was no longer a simple line from weakness to strength, but a tangled knot, a journey inward. But even as I wrestled with these new ideas of emptiness and self, an old purpose still smoldered within me. For 13 years, a single image had been burned into my memory. The face of the man who had cut down the ronin, the leader of the bandits who had destroyed my home. The desire for revenge was a deep and stubborn root, and I thought that perhaps by cutting it, I could finally be free. It took years of searching, of following cold trails and whispered rumors, but I finally found him. He was no longer a bandit chief, but the aging, semi-respectable master of a small, disreputable dojo in a forgotten port town. His face was heavier, and his hair was grey, but the cruel arrogance in his eyes was unchanged. I walked into his dojo in the middle of the day, where the air was stale with the smell of sweat and unpolished wood. I issued my challenge, and when I told him my village's name, a flicker of recognition and then amusement crossed his face. We met behind the dojo in a small, dusty yard. There was no ceremony here and no honor, for this was not a duel between warriors seeking to test their skill, but simply the end of a long, ugly story. He drew his sword with a practiced ease, his stance low and powerful. He was still strong, still dangerous, but as I drew my own blade, a strange calm settled over me. The teachings of Takuan, the lessons of Hozoen, and the memory of Takezo's ferocity. All of it was present, but it was quiet. My mind was not empty, not yet, but it was still. He attacked first with a furious barrage of cuts meant to intimidate and overwhelm, the same crude, bullying style I remembered from my childhood. Years ago, it would have terrified me, but now I saw it for what it was. It was full of openings, of wasted motion, of anger that clouded judgment. I did not meet his force with my own, but moved with the lessons of the Hozoen spear. I used form and control, deflecting his heavy blows with small, precise movements, letting his own momentum carry him past me. I was a rock, and his rage was a wave that broke against me. He grew frustrated, his attacks becoming more reckless, so I used the stillness I was learning from Takuan's words. I watched his eyes, his shoulders, and the shift of his hips, seeing his patterns and his intent before he even began to move. I was not fighting him anymore. I was simply observing him and reacting to the truths he revealed with every swing. He was an open book, and I read every page. The end was pragmatic and brutal. He lunged in a desperate final thrust, and I sidestepped, my blade moving in a clean, economical arc that he never saw coming. It cut deep into his side, and he gasped, a look of shock replacing the anger on his face. He stumbled backward, his sword falling from his grasp as he clutched at the wound, his eyes wide with disbelief. He sank to his knees and then collapsed into the dust. I stood over his dying body, my sword held ready, and I waited. I waited for the feeling of satisfaction, for the peace that was supposed to come with vengeance fulfilled, for the ghosts of my past to finally be laid to rest. But nothing came, no feeling of release, no sense of triumph. There was only the sight of a pathetic old man bleeding into the dirt, his life fading from his eyes, the purpose that had driven me for 13 years. The fire that had forged me into a swordsman had been extinguished in a single, anticlimactic moment. As he lay dying, a profound and terrifying hollowness opened up inside me. The root of my revenge had been pulled, but it had left a gaping void. I had achieved the one goal that had defined my life since I was a boy, and the achievement meant nothing. I had spent more than a decade chasing a shadow, and now that I had caught it, my hands were empty. I was a master swordsman with control, form, and a quiet mind, but I had no purpose. I was a perfect tool with nothing left to build, a sharp blade with nothing left to cut. I turned and walked away, leaving the dead man in the dust, the cold weight of my own skill, my only companion in a vast, empty future. The emptiness that followed my revenge was a heavier burden than the sword had ever been. Without a purpose to guide me, I was like a ship without a rudder, drifting on a sea of meaningless days. My travels became aimless as I walked from town to town, my fame as a swordsman a hollow echo that meant nothing to me. My journey eventually led me to the coast, to a small fishing village where the air was thick with the smell of salt and the constant sound of the waves crashing against the shore. It was there, on a stretch of white sand, that I first saw him. The afternoon sun was bright, glinting off the water and the steel of his impossibly long sword. He was young, with a striking, almost feminine beauty, and he moved with a grace that seemed to defy the very nature of his weapon. A nodachi so long it seemed it should be unwieldy. He practiced alone, his bare feet sinking into the wet sand at the edge of the surf. As I watched from the cover of the dunes, I realized something extraordinary. He could not hear the waves. His movements were in perfect time with them, but he did not react to their sound because he was deaf. I would later learn his name was Sasaki Kojiro, but in that moment he was just a vision, a silent dance of impossible skill. He wasn't training, not in the way I understood it, by repeating forms or practicing cuts with grim determination. He was playing. He moved with the wind, his long hair and the sleeves of his kimono flowing in the sea breeze. His blade was an extension of that same wind, a blur of silver light that seemed to be a part of the natural world around him. He would leap and spin, his nodachi tracing complex patterns in the air, its tip missing the sand by a hair's breadth. It was breathtaking. I watched, hidden and silent, for hours. My entire journey and my philosophy of the sword were built on the idea of becoming. I was a farmer's son who had willed himself to become a swordsman, taking my anger, my grief, and my fear, and through sheer, bloody-minded effort, forging them into skill. My journey was a struggle, a constant act of imposing my will upon myself and my blade. It was a path of effort. But Kojiro wasn't becoming anything. He simply was. There was no sense of effort in his movements, no sign of a struggle between his mind and his body. He was in a state of perfect, harmonious grace. He wasn't trying to be strong. He was the embodiment of strength. He wasn't trying to be fast. He was speed itself. It was as if he had been born with the sword in his hand, as if the universe itself had taught him its secrets in the language of silence. His duel was with the sea. He would wait for a wave to rush in, and as it retreated, his blade would flash in a famous technique I would later know as the turning swallow cut, a strike so fast it seemed to break the laws of time. He wasn't fighting the wave. He was dancing with it, his timing so perfect and instinctual that he seemed to be a part of its rhythm. This silent encounter planted a new and revolutionary seed in my mind. Tarquin had told me to empty myself, but I'd interpreted it as a mental exercise, a way of quieting the noise in my own head. Kojiro showed me another kind of emptiness. His was not a void, but a state of perfect receptiveness. He was so empty of his own ego and his own striving that he could be filled completely by the world around him. He could feel the shift in the wind, the pull of the tide, and the intention of an opponent, not as external forces, but in the same way I could feel the hilt of the sword in my own hand. I left the coast with a new and unsettling question. What if the ultimate skill wasn't about effort at all? What if it wasn't about forging a will of iron or mastering 1,000 techniques? What if the pinnacle of the warrior's art was to simply get out of your own way, to become so quiet, so empty, and so connected to the world that the sword moved on its own, as naturally and as unstoppably as a wave crashing on the shore? I had spent my life trying to become a sword, but Sasaki Kojiro simply was one, and I knew that my journey was far from over. The image of the deaf swordsman playing with the waves became my new guide, offering a different path that led not through force of will, but through a kind of surrender. I retreated from the world, finding a small, abandoned hut high in the mountains where the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the cry of hawks. For years, I did not seek out duels or fame, only stillness. My training was no longer a battle against myself, but a process of listening. I spent my days in meditation, trying to find the quiet place Tokwan had spoken of, but I also spent my days with the sword. I didn't just practice cuts. I held it, studied its balance and its feel, and the way the light played on its polished steel. And I began to synthesize everything my life had shown me. My style was not born in a flash of inspiration, but was pieced together slowly and thoughtfully, much like a farmer building a stone wall. From my childhood, I took the earth, rediscovering the lessons of the paddy, the importance of a solid stance, and of drawing power up from the ground. My footwork became rooted and pragmatic, a rejection of flashy, unstable movements where there was no wasted energy. Every step had a purpose, and my style would be grounded in the simple, unyielding reality of the soil. From Shinmen Takezo, I took ferocity, but it was a controlled ferocity. I learned that the untamed power of the demon was a tool, not a master, a fire to be stoked in the heat of the moment, a sudden, explosive burst of violence that could shatter an opponent's composure, but it had to be contained within a vessel of absolute control. From the Hozuin temple, I took that vessel. I embraced the philosophy of form, the idea that a strong structure could channel and amplify power. I practiced my cuts not just for speed, but for precision and economy of motion. My sword became a cage, much like the monk's spear, designed to control the space, limit my opponent's options, and guide him toward his own defeat. From the emptiness of my revenge, I took a profound sense of detachment, stripping away the anger that had fueled me for so long. A duel was not a personal struggle, but a problem to be solved, a question of angles, timing, and distance. By removing my ego from the fight, I could see my opponent more clearly, along with his fear, his arrogance, and his weakness. And from Sasaki Kojiro, I took the lesson of harmony and learned to let go. I began to practice not with intent, but with awareness. I would stand in the forest, my sword held loosely, and simply feel the world around me. The shift of the wind, the fall of a leaf, the rustle of an animal in the undergrowth. I learned to trust my instincts and to let my body react without the clumsy intervention of my conscious mind, and my blade began to move with a new fluidity, a grace that was not copied from Kojiro, but that was born of my own quiet connection to the world. After 5 years of isolation, I knew I had created something new. It wasn't just a collection of techniques, it was a philosophy made manifest in steel. My own answer to the questions that had haunted my life. To test it and to know if it was true, I descended from the mountain and sought out a man whose name was known throughout the province, a famous sword master named Lord Izumi, who was renowned for his lightning-fast, invisible draw. I challenged him, and he accepted. We faced each other in his perfectly manicured garden under the watchful eyes of his students. He was the picture of classical swordsmanship, calm, proud, and confident. As we prepared, I didn't focus on him, but on my connection to the earth beneath my feet. I felt the gentle breeze on my skin and quieted my mind until all that was left was a state of pure, ready awareness. He moved, his hand blurring towards his sword as the legendary draw began. But in my stillness, I had seen the subtle shift in his weight, the tensing of his shoulder, the flicker of intent in his eyes, and my own sword was already moving. It was not a reaction born of thought, but an instinctual response, as natural as a flinch from fire. My style wasn't about being faster than him, it was about starting sooner. My blade met him, not at the end of his draw, but in the middle of it. The fight was an expression of my entire journey. Grounded, pragmatic, and brutally ferocious in its final, decisive moment. It was controlled, precise, and utterly detached. A perfect, harmonious expression of my soul. Lord Izumi fell, his famous sword only halfway out of its scabbard. I had won, but this victory felt different from all the others. It was not born of anger or will, but of understanding. It was a quiet affirmation. For the first time, my name was spoken with respect and awe in the dojos of Japan, because I had forged a new way. My victory over Lord Izumi put my name on the map, and I was no longer an unknown wanderer, but a swordsman of note, the founder of a style that was both pragmatic and profound. My fame grew, but it felt distant and unimportant because my focus was elsewhere. For years, two names had dominated the world of the sword, two titans moving on an inevitable collision course, Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro. The wild, untamed demon I had seen by the river, and the deaf, graceful genius I had watched on the beach. Their philosophies were polar opposites, and the world knew that one day they would have to meet.
That day finally came at a small island called Funashima, and because the duel was set to define the era, I knew I had to be there. I traveled to the coast, not as a potential challenger or a fan, but as an expert, a fellow master who understood the deep, invisible currents that would decide the fight. I stood on the shore with a small crowd of officials and witnesses, the sea breeze cold against my face. The tension was unbearable. Kojiro arrived first, a vision of deadly perfection. Dressed in a fine red hori, he stood on the beach, his impossibly long sword, the drying pole, resting on his shoulder. He was calm, radiating a confidence that was almost divine. He was at the absolute peak of his art, a man in perfect harmony with himself and his weapon, the embodiment of unyielding form and of genius polished to its most brilliant sheen. Musashi, true to his reputation, was late. Hours late. It was a deliberate act, a piece of psychological warfare designed to unravel his perfectly composed opponent, and the officials grew angry. Kojiro's calm began to fray at the edges, his serene confidence curdling into impatient fury. When Musashi's boat finally appeared, it was an insult. He arrived not in a proper vessel, but in a simple fishing boat, poled by a local fisherman. He was unkempt, his clothes were soaked, and in his hand he carried not his famous swords, but a crude weapon he had carved from a spare oar during the journey. It was longer than Kojiro's nodachi, a piece of ugly, practical genius. From the shore, I understood Musashi's strategy completely. He was refusing to fight Kojiro on his own terms, and would not engage in a duel of perfect form against perfect form.
as that was a battle he would lose. Instead, he turned the duel into a brawl and dragged the sublime down into the mud, attacking Kojiro's mind and his spirit before a single blow was struck. When Musashi leapt from the boat into the shallow water, Kojiro's rage finally broke. "You are late," he screamed, his voice full of frustrated fury. In that moment, I knew he had already lost, because he had let Musashi dictate the terms of the engagement, abandoning his state of harmonious grace to embrace anger. The fight itself was brutally short. Kojiro, in his rage, unleashed his famed turning swallow cut, a strike of impossible speed and beauty and a perfect expression of his art. But Musashi was prepared. Having studied his opponent, he knew it was coming, and his oversized wooden sword, ugly and graceless, came crashing down. It was not a duel of clashing steel, but of opposing philosophies. Kojiro's perfect, unyielding form against Musashi's ugly, adaptable victory. Adaptability won. Musashi's blow landed a fraction of a second before Kojiro's, and the fight was over. The genius of a generation lay dead on the sand. As I watched Musashi walk away from Kojiro's body, I felt a profound sense of tragedy. One form of genius had triumphed over another, but what did it mean to be invincible under the heavens? The title Musashi had just claimed. Musashi had won not because his swordsmanship was necessarily superior, but because his will to survive and his willingness to use any advantage were absolute. He had not sought to express a perfect art. He had sought only to win. The duel at Genryu Island was not a glorious victory, but it was a lesson. It taught me that at the highest level, the sword is not enough. Victory belongs to the one who understands the heart of his opponent and who can control the psychological space of the battle. It was a grim, ugly, and necessary truth. One great light had been extinguished, and another, a darker, more complex light, now cast its shadow over the entire land. I had witnessed the pinnacle of swordsmanship, and it was not beautiful. It was brutally, terrifyingly real. Years passed, and the duel at Genryu Island became a legend, a story told and retold until the men involved were more myth than flesh. My own path continued as I accepted challenges, taught students, and refined my style until it was a seamless part of me. Yet I often thought of the two men who had defined my journey. The deaf genius now buried in the sand, and the victor who now carried the lonely title of Invincible under the Heavens. I met Miyamoto Musashi again 3 years after his legendary duel, not in a dojo or on a dueling ground, but in a quiet tea house in a remote mountain village. He had aged. The wild, demonic fire in his eyes had cooled to embers, and his face was lined with a deep weariness, the look of a man who had seen too much of the world's violence. He was no longer the demon from the river, but just a man. He recognized me, and our eyes met across the room in a silent acknowledgement of the paths we had both walked. There was no tension, no challenge as we were past that. He invited me to join him, and we sat in silence for a long time, listening to the gentle hiss of the tea kettle. He hadn't brought his swords, which were left at the door as a sign that this was not a meeting of warriors, but of survivors. Finally he spoke, his voice rough like stones grinding together. "The sword is a heavy burden to carry for so long," he said. It wasn't a complaint, but a simple statement of fact. We spoke for hours, having a quiet and profound conversation of the kind that can only happen between two people who have reached the same summit and found it to be a cold, lonely place. We didn't speak of specific duels or famous victories, but of the ghosts of the men we had killed, the faces that linger in the dark moments before sleep. We spoke of the profound loneliness of our path and the way it cuts you off from the simple warmth of an ordinary life. "They call me invincible," he said, a bitter smile touching his lips, "but every victory is a kind of defeat. You kill a man, and you take a piece of his death into yourself. You win, and you are left alone on the field. I asked him the question that had lingered in my mind since Ganryu Island. What does a warrior do when there is no one left to fight? He looked out at the mossy garden beyond the tea house, his gaze distant. You fight yourself, he answered. You fight the pride, the anger, the attachments. You fight the legend they have built around you. That is the last and most difficult battle, and most of us lose it. He had turned to painting and sculpture, channeling the same intense focus he had once reserved for the sword into the stroke of a brush. He showed me a small ink painting of a shrike on a dead branch that was simple, stark, and brutally alive. The art was like his swordsmanship, raw, direct, and stripped of all non-essentials, and I could see he was trying to find a new way, a new path that did not end in bloodshed. Our conversation was not about the sword as a tool for fighting, but as a path to understanding. We were two men who had dedicated our lives to an art of death, and in doing so had come face to face with the deepest questions of life. We had both looked into the abyss of violence and had not been consumed by it, but we were forever changed. When I left him, I felt a strange sense of kinship. We were rivals who would never cross blades, two masters who understood the true cost of the titles we held. He was not a demon, but a man, burdened by his own genius and searching desperately for a piece that his own hands had made impossible to find. Our meeting affirmed a truth I had long suspected. Reaching the summit is not the end of the journey, but only the beginning of the long walk down the other side. The world was changing as the long, bloody era of constant civil war known as the Sengoku period was finally breathing its last. A new shogun had unified the country, and a fragile peace was settling over the land. For a man like me, whose identity had been forged in the crucible of conflict, peace was a strange and unsettling concept. The skills I'd spent a lifetime perfecting were becoming obsolete. What is a sword without a war? What is a swordsman without an opponent? My fame had spread, and I received an unexpected offer from a powerful local lord, a man who had fought in the final great battles of unification. He asked me to serve as the sword instructor for his household samurai, and the offer was a crossroads. To accept meant trading the open road for the gilded cage of a castle, a life of constant risk and freedom for one of security and obligation. The decision was difficult. A part of me, the part that still remembered the boy who left his farm with nothing but a sword and a burning will, recoiled at the idea. To serve a master and be tied to one place felt like a kind of death. But another, older part of me saw the wisdom in it. The era of the wandering duelist was over, and to cling to that life was to become a relic, a ghost haunting a world that no longer had a place for him. I accepted the position. My new life was one of routine and repetition, where I woke with the castle bell instead of the rising sun, and I slept in a fine room with tatami mats instead of under the stars. My duels were no longer to the death. They were demonstrations in a spacious, polished dojo, my blade stopping an inch from a student's throat. I was teaching an art of killing to young men who, with luck, would never have to kill. This new life presented a profound internal conflict, for I was facing a new enemy, one far more subtle and insidious than any swordsman. My new enemy was peace itself, and the challenge was no longer about survival, but about relevance. How do you keep the spirit of the sword alive when its deadly purpose has been stripped away? The sword for me had always been a tool for confronting the ultimate truths of life and death, but in the dojo it was in danger of becoming a mere sport, a formal dance with no soul. I struggled to impart the deeper lessons to my students. They wanted to learn the fast draw that had defeated Lord Izumi and the secrets to my famous victories, but I tried to teach them what I'd learned in the mountains from Takuan and from watching Kojiro. I taught them stillness and awareness, and I had them stand for hours, just feeling the weight of the sword in their hands and the connection between their feet and the earth. Most of them grew frustrated because they did not understand. They saw the sword as a tool for advancement, for honor, and for glory, while I saw it as a path to self-knowledge. I was trying to teach them that the deadliest opponent they would ever face was not another man with a sword, but the fear and anger within their own hearts. I was teaching them the philosophy of an era that was already dead. Some days I would stand alone in the dojo late at night as the moonlight slanted through the windows, and I would draw my sword, the same one I had pulled from the mud so many years ago. The steel felt cold and alive in my hands, and in the silence I could almost hear the echoes of my past, the roar of bandits, the clash of steel, the quiet wisdom of a monk, and the roar of the sea. I had survived, and I had triumphed, and now my greatest challenge was to find meaning in a world that no longer needed me to be a killer. I grew old within the castle walls, and while the years softened the hard edges of my body, they sharpened the clarity of my mind. My hair turned to snow, and my hands, once instruments of perfect deadly control, became gnarled with age. I had become a fixture at the castle, a living legend whose stories were told to children, and my life of wandering and dueling seemed like a distant dream. One autumn afternoon, a visitor was announced. It was an old woman, traveling alone, who had asked to speak with me, and she was brought to my small house within the castle grounds. Her face was a beautiful map of a long and difficult life, and her eyes, though clouded with age, held a deep, quiet strength. She introduced herself as Otsu. The name meant nothing to me at first, but then she mentioned another name, one that echoed from the deepest chambers of my past, Shinmen Takezo, Miyamoto Musashi. She had heard stories of my life, of my encounters with Musashi, and of my presence at Gonryu Island. She had spent much of her life walking a path that ran parallel to his, sometimes intersecting and often diverging. She had loved the man, not the legend, and she had come to me, perhaps, to find one of the last living people who had seen him for what he was. We spoke for hours as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. We didn't speak as a swordsman and a civilian, but as two old people looking back on the long, winding roads of our lives. She didn't ask me about his technique or his famous battles, but told me about the boy she had known, the angry, lost child named Takezo. She spoke of his moments of doubt, his flashes of kindness, and his desperate, clumsy attempts to find a life beyond the sword. Through her stories, I saw a life that Musashi could have had. She was the other path, the life of simple warmth and human connection that he and I had sacrificed for the way of the sword. She spoke of waiting for him in villages he never returned to, of raising a child who was not his but whom she cared for in his absence, of a life spent in the shadow of his violent genius. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a profound, melancholic acceptance. Her quiet, detailed conversation forced me to confront the stark loneliness of my own path. I had students, and I had the respect of a lord, but I had no Otsu. I had never allowed myself that kind of connection, because the sword demanded everything, and I had given it. I had learned to quiet my mind and to find harmony with the world, but I had never learned to find it with another person. What had I truly gained? I had gained a name, a deep understanding of my own soul, and a kind of peace in my mastery. But what had I lost? I had lost the chance for a simple life, the warmth of a shared meal, not with a fellow warrior, but with a partner, the laughter of a child, the comforting weight of a hand in my own. Listening to Otsu, I realized that the way of the sword, in its purest form, is a path of profound severance that cuts you away from the world in order to understand it. It demands a solitude that is both enlightening and devastating. As she spoke, I saw the ghost of my younger self, the boy who left his father's farm without a word, and realized I had been cutting away connections my entire life. When she left the next morning, the world felt different. A quiet sadness settled over me, which came not from a place of regret, but of understanding. I had chosen my path, and I had walked it to its end, but her visit had shown me the vast, unseen country that lay on the other side of the mountain I had chosen to climb, a land I would never know. My 70th year was a harsh one, as a deep winter settled in my bones, and I knew my time was short. The sword in the corner of my room was now an old friend I no longer had the strength to dance with. My students were now masters in their own right, teaching my style in dojos across the province, and I thought my time as a teacher was over. Then he arrived. He was a boy of 16, arrogant and full of a restless fire that felt painfully familiar to me. He was the grandson of the lord I served, a prodigy with the sword, and he was convinced he was the greatest swordsman in the world. He demanded that I, the living legend, become his personal tutor. My first instinct was to refuse because I was tired, and his pride was like a wall. But then I looked into his eyes and saw myself. I saw the same desperate hunger to impose his will on the world, the same belief that strength was the only answer. I saw the boy who had hacked at trees in the dark. I agreed to teach him, but not on his terms. We will not train in the dojo, I told him. Our lessons will be in the fields. He was confused and annoyed, but his family's honor demanded he obey. I took him to a simple, muddy field at the edge of the castle grounds, a place that reminded me of my home. I did not give him a sword, I gave him a hoe. Before you can understand the sword, I said, you must understand the earth from which it comes, and to which we all return. For a week, he did nothing but till the soil. He hated it and complained, his fine clothes ruined and his hands blistered, as he saw as a pointless humiliation. I said nothing and simply watched him. Our first lesson with the sword was in that same muddy field. He took his stance, ready to show me his blindingly fast techniques. No, I said, just stand. Close your eyes. Feel the mud between your toes. Feel the wind. Listen to the world around you. This was his lesson for another week. He was a coiled spring of frustration, but slowly, reluctantly, he began to obey. He began to be still. Instead of teaching him how to kill, I taught him how to see. I would toss a pebble into the air and tell him to cut it, but he would fail, his swings too slow and clumsy. You are looking at the pebble, I explained. You are trying to hit it. Do not try. See its path. Understand its journey from my hand to the ground. Become a part of that journey, and your sword will be in the right place. Our conversations were long and philosophical as I passed down to him my life's wisdom. I told him of the ronin who died for my village, a man whose skill was not enough. I told him of Musashi's untamed power and how it was the reflection of a mind that knew no limits. I told him of Kojiro's grace and how it came from a place of silent connection to the world. I told him of Takuan's sharp words that cut deeper than any blade. The sword is not a tool for victory, I told him, my voice thin, but my words clear. Anyone can learn to kill. The true path of the sword is to use it as a mirror that shows you your own fear, your own anger, and your own pride. To master the sword is to master yourself. It is a path to understanding your own place in the great interconnected web of all things. Slowly, over many months, he began to change. The arrogant fire in his eyes was replaced by a quiet, focused light, and his movements with the blade became less about showing off his speed and more about finding a simple, honest grace. He was learning that true strength was not about dominance, but about balance. My final lesson was a simple one. I had him stand in the middle of the field as the sun was setting and hold his sword, not as a weapon, but as a part of himself. The farmer's hoe nurtures life, I said, and the sword takes it. They are two sides of the same coin, and they are both about connection. The hoe connects you to the earth. The sword connects you to the truth of your own mortality and your opponent's. To be a true swordsman is not to be a great killer, but to be a man who understands the value of a single grain of rice and the weight of a single human life. He stood there for a long time, the setting sun glinting on his blade. He was no longer the arrogant boy who had come to me, but a young man on the beginning of a true path. I had passed on what I knew. My journey was complete. The end came as the spring rains began to fall, a gentle and persistent drumming on the roof that accompanied my own dying. I was not dying in a duel under a blood-red sky with a sword in my hand, but in a quiet room tucked into my bed. My final opponent was not a man, but time itself, and it was a battle I had no desire to win. My legendary sword, the one I had pulled from the mud as a boy, rested in the corner, its steel dark and quiet. It had been weeks since I had last held it, because I no longer needed to. My final moments were not a struggle, but a slow, gentle unfolding, a final letting go. My thoughts drifted unmoored from the anchor of my body, but they did not drift to the great duels, the moments of victory, or the faces of the men I had killed. Those were just ripples on the surface of a much deeper river. Instead, I felt the cool, wet mud squeezing between the toes of a 10-year-old boy, and I felt the life-giving warmth of the sun on my back as I followed my father through the paddy. The memory wasn't a ghost. It was real as the rain outside my window. And in it, the beginning and the end felt like one. Then the cold shock of the steel. I felt the impossible weight of the ronin's blade in my small, trembling hands. It was not a memory of death, but of a question, the question that had set my entire life in motion. The weight of that sword had been the weight of my own ignorance, and I had spent a lifetime trying to understand it. My mind drifted to the riverbank, to the terrifying animal grace of Shinmen Takezo, who I now knew was not a demon to be feared, but a force of nature to be understood, like a typhoon or a flash flood. I saw the calm, serene face of the Hozoin monk, his spear a cage of perfect form, a lesson in control and humility. I heard the sharp, cutting laughter of Takwan Soho, his words dismantling my pride and forcing me to look inward. I saw the silent, beautiful dance of Sasaki Kojiro on the shore, a man so in tune with the world that his sword moved with the tide. These were not separate memories. In the quiet clarity of my final moments, they all flowed together. They were all parts of the same whole, different facets of the same truth. The farmer's earth, the ronin's steel, Musashi's chaos, Hozoin's form, Takwan's emptiness, Kojiro's harmony. They were not contradictions, but were all interconnected. The path to the sword was the path of the sword. A profound peace settled over me, and I finally understood. To be invincible under the heavens was never about defeating every opponent or being the strongest or the fastest. That was a child's dream. The true meaning was to live a life so fully, to follow your path so completely that you no longer saw a difference between yourself and the world, between the self and the sword. It was to reach a place of such deep understanding that you could face life and death with the same quiet acceptance. My breath grew shallow. The sound of the rain faded. The weight of my body disappeared. I had spent my life holding on, to anger, to will, to a sword. And now, in this final piece, there was nothing left to do but let go.